Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're taking a look at the autonomic nervous system. And I'm going to try my best to tell you all the things that I think are most important when it comes to looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. First thing we should begin with is, what is the autonomic nervous system? Well, it's a subdivision of the nervous system itself. So the nervous system being the collection of neurons and glia that allow for communication to occur. If we were to take a look at the nervous system and just have a look at the hierarchy in various divisions, you can take the nervous system and you can subdivide it into what we call the central nervous system and what we call the peripheral nervous system. And remember, the central nervous system is going to be things like the brain stem, the spinal cord, and the cerebellum. That's the central nervous system. It's central anatomically because it sits right down the middle, but it's also central functionally because this is the site of integration. This is where we make sense of information. So that's the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is everything that shoots out and away and comes back into the central nervous system. So all the neurons that come and shoot out and away, and all the neurons that go back in to the central nervous system, they're termed the peripheral aspects of the nervous system. And think about it like this. Any signal that's going out and away from the central nervous system, it's obviously going to be a motor signal. So it's sending information to muscles, tissues, or glands to tell them to do something. Muscle to contract, gland to release some sort of substance. Any signal going into the central nervous system, it must be sensory. It's going to tell the central nervous system about what's happening to the environment outside or the environment inside. So that means, through looking at this, the peripheral nervous system can be divided up even further into the sensory aspect and the motor aspect. Now, in actual fact, you can break this up even further because think about it. Let's first look at sensory. What type of sensory information can we have? We can have sensory information that's coming in that we can become consciously aware of. Information about touch, pressure, pain, temperature, for example. This type of sensory information we call somatic sensory. Somatic sensory. And it actually goes to a part of the brain which sits right here in the parietal lobe called the somatosensory cortex, the somatosensory cortex. Somato means body. So you can actually have the somatic division, and this is telling us information that we're going to become consciously aware about, right? Now, you can also have sensory information that's coming in that you don't become conscious about, but it's giving your central nervous system information about the organs of your body. So how dilated or constricted are your blood vessels? How dilated or constricted are certain hollow tubes? So your gastrointestinal tract, your reproductive tract, your renal system, for example. It gives information about all those different structures, and you do not become consciously aware of that. And we call that visceral sensory. So then we've got the visceral division here. And it's all about unconscious information. You don't become consciously aware. All right, so there's sensory. Motor. What about motor? Well, what type of motor output can you have? It can again be about conscious movement, which is going to be skeletal muscle basically, and you can have unconscious movement. Now, motor isn't just movement. Motor is muscles, tissues, glands, and again, it could be the glands to secrete something, for example. So let's just take a look. Motor can be divided into somatic, which is again the conscious movement, and that's basically just skeletal muscle, right? And then you can have visceral here. You can have the visceral aspect. So this is organs and it's unconscious. Unconscious. So when we take a look at the visceral, the unconscious aspect, somatic's conscious, skeletal muscle, visceral is going to be things like cardiac muscle, so your heart, smooth muscle, hollow inside of your organs, and glands as well to secrete hormones or other various substances. Could be salivation, for example. It could be your digestive enzymes, a whole bunch of stuff. So that's unconscious. Now, this is where, and you're probably thinking, oh, finally he's getting to it. This is where we start looking at the autonomic division, because this visceral aspect is autonomic. It's unconscious. So you could call this autonomic, which sounds like automatic, which is basically what it's referring to. It's the autonomic division of the motor system, which is a division of the peripheral nervous system. So this autonomic division, you can actually break up further, right? So think about this now. I want you to think about this. If you've got all this motor output, it's coming out, it's going to your organs to tell them to do stuff unconsciously. What type of things is it going to tell to do? The heart to contract and beat. It's going to tell the smooth muscle inside all your body, that's blood vessels, gastrointestinal tract, renal system, reproductive system, whole bunch of areas to either constrict or dilate. It's going to tell glands to release substances, whether it's salivation or digestion, or maybe it's various hormones, right? How could you divide that even further? Well, you can divide it like this, because the whole reason why this system exists is to maintain homeostasis without you being consciously aware of it. And how can you maintain homeostasis? Well, you can maintain homeostasis in times of relaxation, sitting down, having a bite to eat, having a chat, reading a book, you're relaxed. So maintaining homeostasis in this relaxed state. But you can also maintain homeostasis on the flip side of that, a stress state. Somebody's coming at you with a knife, or a dog is barking and jumping at you, right? Times where you're fearing for your life. Two very different things, resting and relaxing, and fighting or flighting, running away, right? And these are the two divisions of the autonomic. And we call them the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And the way we look at that is the sympathetic division is the fight or flight. And the parasympathetic is the rest or digest division. Now you can take a step back and go, what type of organs are going to fit and activities are going to fit underneath each of these? That's what I want to take a look at now. So let's now take a look at the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system in more detail. I want you to think about if the sympathetic nervous system, if this gets activated in times of fight or flight, in actual fact, it's known as the 4 Fs. Fight, flight, fright, and making love. Now, when this gets activated, its job is to keep you alive in that moment, to maintain homeostasis in that particular moment. So what organs will you activate and what would be their function? So an easy experiment to do here is we've all been scared before, all right? So if you've ever nearly walked across the street, haven't looked to the side and nearly got hit by a bus, firstly, what did you feel like? What was the first thing you felt? Your heart rate, right? So here, one of the things that happens is in regards to your heart, that's going to be one of the organs that's affected here. What happens? Well, heart rate increases. Why would your heart rate increase during this moment? Well, if your heart beats faster, it's going to pump more blood around your body. Why is that important? Well, your blood contains oxygen and nutrients, which, if you want to fight or run away, you need to deliver that to your muscles. So, heart rate increases to deliver more oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood to your muscles. That's the first thing. The other thing is you can feel like your heart's about to pump out of your chest, right? So the contractile force increases as well. For the exact same reason, the harder the heart pumps, the more blood that gets ejected, more oxygen and nutrients gets delivered to the important tissues of your body. So that's the heart. What else happens? What happens to your breathing? Your breathing rate increases. So respiratory system is affected. And in what way? Well, breathing rate increases. What we call respiratory rate increases. Why? Same reason as here. More oxygen into the cardiovascular system gets delivered to the system. The other thing that actually happens, which you wouldn't be aware of, is your airways dilate. They open up. And so we call that bronchodilation. Bronchodilation. Your airways relax and open up. Again, to let more air in that contains more oxygen to be delivered to the tissues of your body. So that's the respiratory system. What about when you look in the mirror? What do you look like? You look really pale, right? So something's happening to your blood flow. So you could say cardiovascular. Cardiovascular. So what's happening there? Well, it's really interesting because the blood vessels in your peripheral vascular system, so that your peripheral blood vessels, they constrict. Why? Well, they constrict because there's no point delivering all this blood to your skin when your muscles need that blood. So they redirect or shunt that blood to deeper areas of your body for two reasons. One, to deliver all that oxygen and nutrients to the muscles so you can fight or flight. But two, if you get cut or damaged, you're less likely to bleed out. Very smart. So cardiovascular system. So the peripheral blood vessels will constrict. But other various blood vessels, like those of the muscles, blood vessels of the muscles, they dilate, for example. And so more blood gets redirected to other important areas of the body. And finally, and there's other system effects, but last one I want to really talk about is that of your pupils. What happens to your pupils? They dilate. They get bigger. Why would your pupils dilate and get bigger? It's so that you can see more around you. If your pupils are constricted, it's because you're focusing in on one point. But if your pupils are dilated, you can see more. Now, the image may not be better, but you can see more in your peripheral and you can see attackers coming at you. So your pupils dilate. So you could say your eyes, pupil dilation. Pupil dilation. Brilliant. These are some of the effects. Makes sense. They're all there to keep you alive in that moment. What about the parasympathetic nervous system? What do you think's happening here? So this is resting and digesting, relaxing. It's actually the flip side of this. So you could basically take all the same organs and then flip it upside down. So what happens when you're relaxing? Let's first take the heart. Well, when you're relaxing, your heart rate drops and the contractile force drops. So heart rate decreases and the contractile force decreases. Now, the whole reason why is because there's no point wasting your heart capacity, its ability to pump harder and faster. That requires energy, right? But you're in time of resting and relaxation. So during this time, your heart doesn't need to beat as hard or as fast. It's conserving its energy. So it relaxes, both heart rate and contraction. What about your respiratory system? So if we look at the respiratory system, your respiratory rate decreases for the exact same reason as we spoke about there. What about your airways? They actually constrict. You actually get bronchoconstriction. Broncho. So your airways, broncho, because you get your bronchi, the big airways, and the bronchioles, the smaller ones that have the smooth muscle in it. It's those we're talking about. So you could say bronchiolar dilation or bronchiolar constriction, but let's just say broncho. So we've got bronchoconstriction. And you might be thinking, wait, why would I want to constrict my airways? But it's just because you don't need such a great capacity when it comes to resting and relaxation for breathing. So you get bronchoconstriction. Now I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. Keep this in the back of your mind, that when you stimulate sympathetic nervous system, your airways open up. But when you stimulate the parasympathetic, they can actually constrict. Keep that in the back of your mind. All right, cardiovascular, The blood vessels. Again, it's the opposite, right? Cardiovascular effects. And we're talking about blood vessels predominantly here. So peripheral blood vessels, those in the periphery, they actually dilate. You get dilation of the peripheral blood vessels. And then when you get those of the muscles, it's going to be constriction. Constriction. Again, blood vessels. And then pupils, if we look at the eyes, they're going to constrict. And again, because when your pupils constrict, you get to focus in. You might be reading a book, you're relaxing, and your pupils constrict. So what we've highlighted here are some of the major functions and effects of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we needed to go through them because of the next part. What we now need to look at is the anatomy of these systems, the neurotransmitters that they use, and how they speak to the organs, glands, or target structures in order to tell them to do these things. So let's now take a look. So what I've drawn up here is the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord, and we're going to take a look at the neurons associated with each of these. Remember, this is motor output. This is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, and that subdivision is the motor system. And obviously, its subdivision is that of the autonomic. So, a couple of things here is this. When we look at both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, they are both 2 neuron chains. That means 2 neurons will come out of the brain, brainstem, or spinal cord, and one will come straight out, speak to a second neuron, which will come out and speak to the target organ or gland. Let's have a look at that. Firstly, sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system actually has another name. And that other name, and we're going to write it up in red. That other name is the thoracolumbar system. The thoracolumbar. So there's 2 words there. Thoraco, meaning thoracic, lumbar, meaning the lumbar region. So the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord, if we were to take a look at that, thoracic, lumbar. Thoracic and lumbar. The neurons for the sympathetic nervous system come out of the thoracic and lumbar regions. So let's take a look at that. We're going to have a neuron come out like that. And let's just do one here as well. Have a neuron come out like that. And so what we can see is they're very short neurons, and they're going to talk to their second neuron. And the second neuron is really long. Really long. All right, that's the first thing. Let's now take a look at the parasympathetic. When we look at the parasympathetic, it's not called the thoracolumbar, it's called the craniosacral. Craniosacral. And that's because there's got cranio for cranium or cranial, like cranial nerves, and sacral referring to the sacral aspect. So craniosacral. Cranio or cranial, that's right, cranial, and then sacral. Now, these neurons that come out, the first one is usually quite long, and the second one is quite short. Same goes here. First one is quite long, and the second one is quite short. All right, let's name these, right? It's a 2 neuron chain for both, I said that. 1, 2, and that's the parasympathetic nervous system. 1, 2, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. These neurons have names. The first of which, the first one that comes out, is called the preganglionic neuron. The very first one is called the preganglionic neuron. And the reason why it's called that is because that anytime you've got a collection of cell bodies, there's a cell body, there's a cell body, there's a cell body, there's a cell body. Anytime you've got a collection of cell bodies that sits outside the nervous system, it's called a ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside the nervous system, right? Hence why this is called the preganglionic neuron, because its cell body is in the central nervous system. So it's not called a ganglion. This one is. So that's why this second one is called the postganglionic neuron. Because you can see this neuron shoots out after the ganglion. Postganglionic neuron. Postganglionic neuron. So now we've labeled those. All right, let's start with the preganglionic neuron of every single one. In order for it to speak to the next one, it must release a chemical that can speak to the postganglionic neuron. That chemical is going to be a neurotransmitter because we're talking about the nervous system. What is the neurotransmitter here that we need to talk about? Well, this releases a neurotransmitter that crosses the synapse. This releases a neurotransmitter that crosses the synapse. So does that, and so does that. All right. What is this neurotransmitter? In actual fact, it's the exact same neurotransmitter for all four. And that neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, which we sometimes just write as capital A, capital C, lowercase h, acetylcholine. So this is acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. In order for it to have its function, it must bind to acetylcholine specific receptors, and there's two major types. There's nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic and muscarinic. What's the one here? The receptor here that it needs to bind to, for all of them in actual fact. So here's the receptor that it must bind to. That's called a nicotinic receptor. So let's write it here. Nicotinic. Let's just write it as N. So this is going to be nicotinic, nicotinic, nicotinic. Perfect. Now it's bound, stimulated, action potential has been sent down this postganglionic neuron for each. And now it's going to go towards its target organ, its effector. So let's have a look. Let's draw up some of the ones we spoke about, right? So what did we say? We said the eyes and pupil. That was one. So we've got the eye and the pupil. So that was one. Another one we spoke about, we didn't draw up, but we spoke about was salivation, right? Salivation and release of digestive enzymes. So let's put this up here, salivation. Let's see if I can draw this. I'm not the best drawer, as you're aware. And let's have that tongue that comes out. That is a tongue, and there's salivation that's happening. What else did we talk about? We spoke about the heart, right? We also spoke about the airways. We spoke about all these various, and we spoke about blood vessels. So there are all, and there's obviously others, but there's some of our target structures. Now, what are we going to do? Firstly, we should talk about, which one? Let's talk about the parasympathetic, the rest and digest. And the reason why I want to talk about that one first is it's easier because the neurotransmitter it releases here, right at the end, so the postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine again. Acetylcholine, acetylcholine. So, you get asked a question in an exam, the parasympathetic nervous system, the only neurotransmitter it deals with is acetylcholine at both the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. What receptors? Nicotinic here at the postganglionic neuron, but at the target structure, it's muscarinic. Muscarinic. So you're going to have a muscarinic receptor at the pupil here, and at the heart, muscarinic receptor. At the salivary glands, I know that's not on the tongue, but it's muscarinic. So I'll write it here, and then we'll just use muscarinic. and then we'll just use M like that. So muscarinic. It's going to be here on the airways, muscarinic, and on the blood vessels, muscarinic. Beautiful. Now, think about what happens. The acetylcholine binds to the muscarinic receptor and has its effect. So at the pupils will they'll constrict, right? It's parasympathetic. We're resting and digesting. So the pupils constrict. When acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors at our salivary glands, we salivate so we can digest food better. At our heart, acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors to slow it down. At our airways, it binds to it to constrict. At the blood vessels, well, it depends which blood vessel. If it's periphery, dilate. Muscular, constrict. All right, so we've done that. Important point here is you might be thinking cranial. I've heard of cranial nerves before. Remember, there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Those 12 pairs, to touch and feel very good velvet are heaven. All right. There's 4 cranial nerves that are also known as parasympathetic nerves. Do you know what those 4 cranial nerves are? They're cranial nerves 3, so that's OOO, olfactory, optic, oculomotor. So that's oculomotor nerve. 7, OOO, to touch and feel, F, facial nerve, facial. 9, OOO, to touch and feel very good, glossopharyngeal. And then last one is cranial nerve 10, which is vagus, the vagus nerve. So we've got oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. They're all cranial nerves that are also parasympathetic in their effect. What do? So number 3 is actually responsible here. That's the cranial nerve that comes out to tell your pupils to constrict is going to be the oculomotor nerve. 7 for facial, salivation. 9, glossopharyngeal, also salivation, but different types of salivation because we've got different sublingual, submaxillary, parotid. So it's just they have different effects, right? Different targets. And then the vagus nerve actually does pretty much all the others, right? Does the heart, does the airways, does aspects of the blood vessels, right? Perfect. All right. Next is sympathetic. So what is the neurotransmitter that's being released here? So we've got acetylcholine at the preganglionic. Postganglionic is not acetylcholine. But I want you to think it's an easy one to remember. Why is it easy to remember? When you have a sympathetic effect, some people say, I just had an adrenaline rush. So the neurotransmitter is noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine. Noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine. So let's just write it as NORAD. NORAD. It will bind to adrenergic receptors. So it's adrenaline, it binds to adrenergic receptors. Receptors that will either allow for noradrenaline to bind to or adrenaline. What's the difference between noradrenaline and adrenaline? They're pretty much the same, but here's the major difference. Noradrenaline, that's the neurotransmitter. Adrenaline, that's a hormone. That's the major difference. All right. They're going to bind to adrenergic receptors. And there's more than just the 2 kinds that we have for acetylcholine, nicotinic and muscarinic. There's alpha and beta. And I want to talk to you about those and what they do. But very quickly, think about this. Noradrenaline binds to these structures, pupils dilate, salivation stops, heart rate increases, airways dilate, blood vessels, depending on where they are, will either constrict or dilate. Last point here is this. There is a preganglionic neuron that comes out, all the way out, and I'm going to put it here, and it's just a preganglionic neuron, no postganglionic neuron. And it speaks to, and this is not going to be a surprise, that's the kidney, and the kidney has a hat that sits on top. Do you know what that hat's called? The adrenal gland. Now, it's called ad, meaning on, renal, kidney, the on kidney gland, but that's the prefix of adrenaline. Why? Because this preganglionic neuron, now what neurotransmitter do preganglionic neurons release? They all release acetylcholine. And so the adrenal gland will have acetylcholine specific receptors, nicotinic, right? And it's going to bind and it's going to stimulate the adrenal gland to release something. What is that something going to be? It's going to be adrenaline. It releases adrenaline. Now, where does it release this adrenaline to? The bloodstream. Remember I said it was a hormone? It's a hormone. Hormones get released into the bloodstream. And if it's in the bloodstream, it goes everywhere. So that means that the adrenaline that's released from stimulating the sympathetic nervous system goes into the bloodstream and literally will go to all of these structures to tell them to do their thing, which means, what does this mean for the sympathetic nervous system? You can't have a localized sympathetic effect. You don't just have your pupils dilate. You don't just have your heart rate increase. You don't just have your airways dilate in a fight or flight response. You have all of them happen. And that's because the preganglionic neuron that speaks to the adrenal gland tells it to release adrenaline that goes into the bloodstream and goes everywhere. Final thing I want to tell you about are the different receptors associated with adrenaline and noradrenaline and what they do. How can we distinguish about telling, because I said, it tells heart rate to increase, but tells airways to relax and open up. So how does this work? Let's take a look. So here is your cheat sheet for understanding adrenergic receptors, the different types and how they work. Do this for me. So with your adrenergic receptors, you can have alpha and you can have beta. So do alpha, beta like that. Now do alpha, beta like that as well. Now write A1, B1. Now write A2, B2. Now draw a box around them like this. And under here, write stimulate. Under here, write inhibit. All right, we're getting there. Now, where do you find alpha-1 receptors? Remember, we're talking specifically sympathetic nervous system here, right? Right? And you know now the organs that it affects. So A1 is found on all sympathetic organs, found on all relevant sympathetic organs, all smooth muscle, glands, and tissue of the sympathetic nervous system. They all contain alpha-1. Beta-1 is located at the heart and juxtaglomerular cells. Glomerular cells. Now, if you haven't done the renal system yet, just write kidneys. B2 is found on, B2 is found on all the relevant smooth muscle, glands, and tissue of the sympathetic nervous system. And A2 is found on the presynaptic terminals of sympathetic neurons. Presynaptic terminals. Now, what does all this mean? All right. So alpha-1 and beta-1, if you throw adrenaline or noradrenaline at these receptors, they stimulate the structure to do their function. So for example, any smooth muscle, glands, or tissue that has alpha-1 receptors, if I throw adrenaline or noradrenaline at them, if it's smooth muscle, it's going to tell them to constrict. If it's a gland, it's going to tell it to release. its substance. Compare it here to beta 2, which if I were to throw adrenaline or noradrenaline at beta 2 receptors, it will tell the smooth muscle glands and tissues to not do their function. So if I throw adrenaline, noradrenaline at beta 2 and it's located on a smooth muscle, it will tell that smooth muscle to relax. It will tell it to dilate. It will tell the gland to not release its hormone or chemical or substance. Hopefully that makes sense. Here at beta 1, it stimulates. So beta 1's found at the heart. It's stimulating the heart. Increase heart rate, increase contractile force. The juxtaglomerular cells are important for blood pressure, right? The renin release. So if beta 1's located at these cells, if you throw adrenaline and noradrenaline at the beta 1 cells in the kidneys here, it stimulates it to release renin, and then you get the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. I'll just write that. The renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. I've done a whole video on it, so please feel free to watch it. It's how your kidneys maintain long-term blood pressure. And then finally, if I throw adrenaline, noradrenaline at alpha 2 receptors, and they're located at the presynaptic terminals, its job is to inhibit the postsynaptic neuron, the postsynaptic or the postganglionic sympathetic neuron to send its signal. Remember, it's a 2-neuron chain, right? 1, 2. And let's just say you've got a particular tissue here. Here's some cells, right? And they're going to have a sympathetic effect if you stimulate them. But alpha 2, presynaptic terminals. So here, if you throw adrenaline at it, it stops it from sending the signal to the next neuron. So inhibitory. Hopefully that makes sense. So now you can think about this. Let's look at specific examples. So the heart's easy. This is the one that's responsible for increasing heart rate and increasing contractile force. This one's easy, stimulates blood pressure. Why do you want your blood pressure to go up? Because it pushes more blood around the body to distribute oxygen, nutrients, so forth. So beta 1's really important, blood pressure, heart, right? Alpha 1, stimulate. What's it going to stimulate? Well, it's going to stimulate peripheral blood vessels to constrict. So this is a peripheral blood vessel, and it stimulates it to constrict, for example. So that's really important. It's going to, now think about this, right? Let's go over here to inhibit. What muscle do we want to inhibit? Our airways. Remember, you want your airways to open up. So beta 2 receptors are found on your airways. So it's going to tell your bronchioles to dilate so you can get more air in. That's how that works. It just says muscles relax. They open up. Really, really important. And then the alpha 2 receptors are just going to be found at neurons where we want to inhibit that particular effect. Obviously, you can take any sympathetic organ and now fit it and reverse engineer. Instead of memorizing what receptors sit, you can reverse engineer it and say, okay, I know this structure does this, it's likely to have which particular receptor. So we can now take a look very quickly and talk about beta blockers. We know that's a drug or medication. Beta blockers. Beta blockers. And you can have specific and non-specific beta blockers. Think about it. If you have a non-specific beta blocker, it's going to block both beta 1 and beta 2. What's going to be the effects? Well, it's going to slow your heart rate down, but it may also result in what? Bronchoconstriction. So maybe an asthmatic doesn't necessarily want a non-specific beta blocker. So a specific beta blocker, they're usually targeted at inhibiting the heart, slowing the heart rate down, reducing blood pressure, reducing the contractile force. So beta blockers can and have been used for people with hypotension, elevated blood pressure, for example. That's just an example. So hopefully you enjoyed this. This is a summary and overview of the autonomic nervous system. Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. We've got hundreds of others just like this. If you want to contact us, please do so on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Dr. Mike Todorovic, at DrMiketodorovic. Speak to you soon.